A lot of people would say you have badly damaged your country.
I'd say, can you show that? Is there any demonstration? Because I've been asking the United States, the press has been asking the United States government for a year now, if after a year they can't show a single individual who's been harmed in any way by this reporting, is it really so grave? Is it really so serious? And can we really trust those claims without scrutinizing them? I'd argue that we can't, but we should be open to it. It's fair, the possibility exists. And if this has caused some serious harm, I personally would like to know about it.
As it is with everything in a global discourse, there is always more than meets the eye. Often it takes months, even years, to uncover what we eventually learn is reality. This day we have two instances of this very discussion. A new book detailing what happened on the ground at the American embassy in Benghazi, and the amount of information terrorists are getting every day about American intelligence and how they're using it to their advantage. Welcome to MidPoint. Constitutional law professor at the Pepperdine University School of Law and retired U.S. Ambassador Douglas Kmiec joins us. Doug, thanks so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
You recently wrote, and this is the one thing I think that is very interesting, terrorists now know one of our methods of collection, and while that can be a bad thing, it can also be a deterrent. Would you please dig into that a little bit more for us?
Well, the consequence of the Snowden revelations is that they know the extent to which we can capture in bulk telephone information, the telephone number from which the call originates, the length of time, the place that's being called. What is being captured does not include the content, but it does include some fairly significant information about where people are and what numbers they're calling. Now, that, in one level, you can say, well, that's disclosed something that can harm us. But it also means that it's going to change the behavior of terrorists, and some of that behavior now has to change to very awkward, more expensive face-to-face meetings, and those meetings will start to expose them. They'll start to expose them to our other means of intelligence, both human and technical, and that can be to our advantage. In essence, by shutting down, by publicly shutting down one method of gathering intelligence, we force them into others, and some of those others are less easily accomplished, and that will be to our advantage.
I know that publicly the NSA would never say it out loud, but maybe it's worth saying quietly at least. Should they almost be a little bit happy that this has happened, because in essence it may expose problems and expose a lot of the holes that they have, and then force them simply to do a better job in keeping up with what is now 21st century terrorism?
Well, that's another aspect of it. I mean, once you've got a system that is public, then people who have technological capability to improve it will have to address it as well. I think that's right.
Let me talk about human intelligence here a little bit, because you use that, and that's always something that the intelligence experts and I are constantly talking about here. Is it fair to say perhaps that the NSA and others have become a little too lenient or a little too necessary? In fact, they have to get metadata, and they're looking to get all the electronics that they can, and maybe we have fallen down a little bit in that human side of things, getting it from the ground, which seems to be in many ways a whole lot more reliable.
Well, it is more reliable. It takes much more time, and it takes greater skill, and it takes the effective use of personnel in U.S. embassies around the world. You know, people talk about Edward Snowden, and they try to evaluate whether he's a hero or a goat, whether he's advanced the interests of his country or whether he's harmed them. I think the person who really harmed our interests was Julian Assange, who rather indiscriminately exposed cables and confidential memoranda that travel from the outposts, the embassies, back to Maine State, the State Department, and made it much more difficult for our internal communications, and also, on the topic we're talking about, exposed a significant number of informants' names, or at least suggested they were informants, and put them in jeopardy. So years of gathering goodwill and support with people supplying us human intelligence were put at risk by Mr. Assange, in a way that Mr. Snowden's exposures and disclosures did not entail.
We've seen this in many instances around the world in a lot of different things. For instance, when it comes down to fighting terrorists, ISIS, for instance, comes to mind. A lot of military intelligence specialists will say, we simply don't have anybody on the ground. We don't have people there who speak the language. We don't have people there who understand the culture. And that's very important to getting where we need to go. Is this something that, in your opinion, we need to focus on now more than anything else? And not only will it help us gathering intelligence, but certainly help us as we go to quote-unquote war with a lot of these new terrorist groups. And again, I bring us back to ISIS.
Well, there's no question but that one of the methods of ISIS or ISIL is to ingratiate themselves, to integrate themselves into Western society, to know everything there is to know about us. If we're not doing the same as a matter of counterterrorism policy, we're not protecting ourselves. We're not engaging them where, in fact, they operate. So we have to have our contacts in the communities in which they've located and in the places in which they frequent, whether they're businesses or otherwise, and that is essential. But I think, you know, there's a reasonable case for the technological aspects of it as well. They raise difficult issues of constitutionality and statutory authority, like the ones brought up in the Second Circuit last week. But this goes, you know, we've never completely solved our dilemma with the asymmetrical war against terrorism, and that is that on the one hand, the most effective means are preventive, and our constitutional legal arguments are focused more on prosecution. They're focused more on punishment. They're focused more on assigning specific responsibility to a given individual, whereas the means and methods of the NSA are focused on the future, on trying to prevent harm rather than punishing it.
In your opinion, did our government simply get lazy in many ways? And the government itself is the ones, because I say this, so many intelligence agents always will tell you, the guys and the gals on the ground know what needs to be done. They're the ones who know what needs to happen. But all too often their hands are just completely bound by the government, who doesn't, whatever administration it is, who doesn't seem to understand sometimes what they do and what they need to get it done on a daily basis.
I think that's well said, and I think there's a fair amount of truth to that. I mean, the people that I know who are engaged in human intelligence gathering are very dedicated. They put their lives at risk. They're making great sacrifices for their country, and they're gathering this information. Often it's piece by piece, and it takes years to do so. And yet when they send it to Washington, it tends to be undervalued. Washington has this sort of know-it-all attitude, even with respect to the people who are in the front lines, and that just makes no organizational sense whatsoever. It harms, obviously, the president's decision-making and everyone else in Washington who would otherwise be quite advantaged by the on-the-ground information coming up from embassies and other stations.
When you speak about embassies now as a former ambassador, I would like to ask you about what is now being said about Benghazi. A new book is out. Those who are on the ground are pretty much saying what a lot of us knew for months, and a lot of what had been rumored and reported on for a long time, as to the complete disconnect that went on there. As a former ambassador, and you look at the way these things are shared, how angry are you that something like that could happen, that those people could be placed in such danger, and there seems to be a real disconnect that actually could have saved those people at the embassy?
Well, I haven't had the advantage of reading the new book, but I do know this issue quite well because Chris Stevens was a colleague and a friend. He stayed with me at the embassy in Malta for a brief period of time as he was outfitted for his special envoy work. So I got to know him, and I greatly respect him and his memory. And it's but let me say this about what could have been done to save him. I'm certain there were specific things that could have been done that evening that would have had the effect of dispersing people who were attacking that consular office. One of the grave difficulties, which was identified, again, and here's one of these places where...
I have about 30 seconds, sir, just to let you know.
information from the ground would have been helpful. AFRICOM, our military command structure, was being headquartered out of Germany. It had no presence in the continent where it was needed, and as a result, the military resources needed to help Chris Stevens on that evening were far too distant and far too controlled by EUCOM, the European Command, and that was a great disadvantage.
Ambassador Douglas Kmiec, thank you so much for your comments. And if you don't mind, I think as this whole situation with Benghazi goes forward, certainly with intelligence, we would certainly appreciate talking to you again very soon.
Happy to talk to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Later on this hour, it may seem a little hyperbolic, but it's not a bad idea to consider how Joan Rivers changed the world. After the break, minds are changing in both directions about the Washington Redskins nickname.